There are houses that remember, not in the way poets speak of memory, not in the settling of foundations or the language of creaking wood that night temperatures draw from old timber, but in the way a wound remembers the blade that made it. Closed, defended, held shut by pressure from within. In the winter of 1887, in a farmhouse outside Harrowfield, Pennsylvania, a family of 6 moved into a property that had sat vacant for 11 years. Within 4 months, 3 of them would be dead or critically ill. Within 6, the county coroner would quietly seal his own report and file it under a category that did not exist in any official registry. The property had changed hands 5 times in 46 years. Each sale had been conducted below market value, and each family that left had done so without the kind of public explanation that rural communities in that era typically demanded of their members, and without it being offered. Something passed with the deed, unseen, from one set of hands to the next. Not a defect of timber or foundation, but a presence in the structure itself. Something compressed and sealed and ancient in the way that violations of the deepest human order can become ancient within the span of a single decade. What investigators found beneath the main parlor floor was not a cellar. It was not a root storage. The room had no door. It had no ventilation that could be identified from any exterior examination of the building. It had no entrance except the one that had been nailed shut from above. Deliberately, carefully, with a precision that suggested the person who sealed it knew exactly what they were sealing inside, and understood that what they were sealing inside needed to remain there. What follows is the account of the Varnell family, of the house on Cutter's Ridge Road, and of the thing that had been waiting, patient, silent, and utterly human, for someone to finally pull up the boards. Before we continue with the story of the Varnell family and the house on Cutter's Ridge Road, if you've never heard this account before, you're not alone. It was buried for nearly a century in county records that were never meant to be public. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear so you never miss a story that history tried to forget, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? The region of western Pennsylvania that contains the Harrowfield Township sits in a narrow valley between ridges that run roughly northeast to southwest. The kind of topography that makes a community feel enclosed without being isolated. Connected to the wider world by roads that traverse the gaps between hills, but perpetually framed from within by the sight of high ground on every horizon. By the 1880s, the area had accumulated enough decades of economic ambition and partial collapse to give it the particular atmosphere of a place that had expected more of itself. The hills had been stripped of their most accessible timber by the mid-1860s. The work of 2 decades of sawmill operations that had seemed, when they began, like the establishment of a permanent industry, and had turned out to be the rapid consumption of a finite resource. The sawmills had opened and closed within the same decade. A rail spur had been proposed, surveyed by a party of engineers whose visit had generated considerable local excitement, and then quietly dropped when the company financing the extension dissolved under circumstances that the Kellerton Courier described only as irregularities in the accounts of the principal officers. Coal had been found in sufficient quantity to encourage speculation, but insufficient quantity to reward it at scale. The land, stripped of its most useful resources, had reverted to its secondary utility, farming, and the slow, patient work of making marginal ground produce enough to sustain the families who worked it. What remained in Harrowfield in the 1880s was a community of roughly 400 souls. They were connected to the larger town of Kellerton by 12 miles of road that followed the valley floor and became genuinely impassable for 6 to 8 weeks every winter. When the combination of freeze and thaw cycles and the weight of wagon traffic turned the surface into something closer to a geological feature than a constructed thoroughfare. The people of Harrowfield were not unusual. They were the ordinary product of a particular kind of American life. Protestant in their majority, careful with money in the way of people for whom financial mistakes had consequences that lasted across generations, suspicious of strangers in the way of communities that had learned to rely on themselves, and deeply invested in one another's business in the way of people who understood that their survival was genuinely collective. And they held church twice on Sundays. They kept meticulous records of land transfers, debt obligations, crop yields, and the vital statistics of their community. They remembered things. They remembered who had sold what and for how much and under what circumstances. And they talked about these matters in the way of people who understood that the economic history of their neighbors was a form of practical knowledge, useful for assessing risk and identifying opportunity. The property on Cutter's Ridge Road had a recorded history going back to 1841, when a man named Absalom Prewitt filed a deed for 43 acres of land in the eastern portion of the township and began construction of the main house within the same season. Prewitt had come to Harrowfield from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, 5 years earlier, and in those 5 years, he had established himself as one of the more capable craftsmen in the region. He was a carpenter by primary trade, but he had the range of practical skills that frontier-adjacent life in early 19th century America required of any man who wanted to be useful. He could set stone. He could read a grade and dig a foundation. He could work green timber into serviceable framing and seasoned timber into fine furniture. He was known to be meticulous. Several structures he had built or contributed to in the Harrowfield area were still standing in the 1880s, and men who knew carpentry could identify his work by the consistency of its joinery and the level of care applied to elements of construction that most builders considered invisible once the walls were up. The foundation of any Prewitt-built structure was set with the same care as the visible facade. The framing was plumb and true in ways that were difficult to achieve and easy to neglect. He built as though the interior of the wall, the hidden skeleton of the structure, mattered as much as the surface. The house he built on Cutter's Ridge Road reflected this character completely. It was a farmhouse of conventional plan for its era. 2 stories, 4 rooms on the ground floor, a sleeping loft above, a cellar accessible from a door in the kitchen floor, a covered porch on the south face, but constructed with an attention to detail that was remarked upon by neighbors who visited during its building. The foundation was fitted stone, the dry laid with the precision of a man who understood load distribution and the behavior of frost heave in the specific soil conditions of the valley. The main floor joists were large, well-seasoned white oak, set on close centers and notched into the sill plate in a way that distributed weight across the full perimeter of the foundation. The floors, when laid, were level and tight-fitted, with no perceptible gaps between boards, no variation in thickness that would show as humming or resonance when walked. They were, in the language of the craft, a dead floor, solid, dense, acoustically dampened by their own mass and the quality of their installation. Prewitt lived on the property with his wife, Constance, and their 4 children from the completion of the house in late 1842 until 1858, when he sold to a family named Doherty and moved west with what his neighbors described, years later in various recollections, as a degree of urgency that was out of proportion to any visible circumstance. There was no public conflict. There was no financial crisis that anyone could identify. The harvest that year had been adequate. Prewitt's business had been steady. He had announced his intention to leave in the spring, and by the end of June the deed was transferred, the goods were packed, and the Prewitt family was gone. The price paid by the Dohertys was notably below what the property might reasonably have commanded. The house alone, by Prewitt's own standard of construction, should have set a higher floor for any negotiation. But there had been no negotiation. Prewitt had named a price, and the Dohertys had paid it. And the transaction had been completed with a speed that suggested both parties had reasons to want it finished quickly. The deed transfer was recorded. The relevant line in the county register was clean. No encumbrances, no conditions, no notes. What was not recorded was everything else. The Dohertys stayed 11 years. Patrick Doherty was an Irish-born farmer who had come to Pennsylvania through New York a decade before the Civil War, part of the massive immigration that the famine of the 1840s had set in motion across the Atlantic world. He was a competent farmer, a steady churchgoer, a man of no particular distinction or notoriety. His wife, Ellen, was quieter than he was and more observant. Neighbors who knew the family well described her as a woman who noticed things, who paid attention to the quality of silence in a room, as well as to its sound. They had 6 children when they bought the house and lost 2 of them to fever within the first 3 years. Not unusual in a period when childhood fevers were a reliable constant in rural communities without reliable medicine, but noted because 2 deaths in 3 years was at the higher end of ordinary loss. A 3rd child, a boy named Dermot, who was 8 at the time of the purchase, died in 1865 in what the county register described as a fall of indeterminate cause. The register's usual practice was to specify the nature of an accidental death. A fall from a barn loft, a fall into the creek, a fall while cutting timber. The phrase indeterminate cause appeared rarely in the record and usually in circumstances that warranted some ambiguity. Or in Dermot Doherty's case, no additional detail was recorded and no inquiry appears to have been made. Patrick Doherty sold the property in 1869 and relocated his surviving family to Allegheny County. He did not advertise the sale, which was unusual in a period when land transfers were typically preceded by at least some period of community discussion. The kind of informal circulation of information that allowed interested buyers to present themselves. The buyer was not from Harrowfield or from Kellerton. He was a Pittsburgh speculator named Clarence Fitch who purchased the property through a correspondent and never visited it at any point during his ownership. A woman named Harriet Cleves, who had been friendly with Ellen Doherty across the 11 years of the family's residence, told her own daughter years later. The daughter was then 50, and the telling had the quality of a confidence long held and only partially released, that Ellen Doherty had wept when the day of departure finally came, not from sadness about leaving a place she had loved. The weeping, as Harriet understood it, was the weeping of a woman putting distance between herself and something she had never been able to name directly, something she had lived with for 11 years by learning not to look at directly. The relief of departure was the relief of a person removing themselves from proximity to a thing they had understood, at some level, to be present, without ever being able to say what the thing was. Harriet Cleves never went into the Doherty house. She had visited it twice in the early years of their tenancy, masked for the kinds of social calls that rural women exchanged, and she had not gone back. She told her daughter that there was a room in that house, the parlor with the eastern wall, that she had never been able to sit in comfortably, even for the duration of a visit. Not because of anything visible, not because of anything she could name. She said it was the quality of the air in that room. She said it sat in the chest differently than air in other rooms, in other houses. She said she had thought about this for many years after, and the closest she had been able to come to a description was that the air felt used. Like air that had been breathed so many times by so many people under conditions of such extremity that it had taken on a character of its own. Not simply stale, but altered, pressed into a different shape by the force of what had passed through it. Harriet was a practical woman of no mystical inclinations. She found her own description embarrassing and said so. But she had lived for 70 years by trusting what her body told her about spaces and situations, and her body had told her consistently across 2 visits to that parlor that something in the air of that room was wrong, in a way that had nothing to do with ventilation or season. She did not know what was beneath the floor. She only knew what she had felt, and she had felt it was not right. The property sat vacant from 1869 to 1880, during which time Clarence Fitch paid the county taxes without apparent interest in the land's productive use. In 1880, where he sold it to a Harrowfield farmer named George Utterback for a price that was again below what the county assessor estimated the land's value to be. Utterback used the acreage for grazing, running a small herd of beef cattle on the grass that had reclaimed the fields during the vacancy, and declined to inhabit the structure. When asked by neighbors why he was not making use of the house, he provided different explanations at different times. The house needed too much work. The house was in the wrong location relative to his other holdings. The house was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season and everything to do with some quality in its construction that he had never been able to identify. He was not a man given to imprecision. He was a farmer of the methodical, economically rational type that the region produced in abundance. His reluctance to inhabit a structurally sound farmhouse on productive land he owned was, to people who knew him, inconsistent with his established character. No one pressed the question very hard. There was one incident during Utterback's ownership that he described to his brother-in-law shortly after it occurred, and then, apparently, never mentioned again. He had gone to the house in the fall of 1881 to address a broken window latch, the kind of maintenance task that a vacant structure occasionally demanded and that he attended to routinely, not from any attachment to the place, but from the practical sense that a deteriorating structure loses value faster than it should. He went in the early afternoon, in good weather, alone. In the main parlor, near the eastern wall, he found that several of the floorboards had been disturbed, not broken, not rotted out from below in a way that would cause visible surface disturbance, lifted and reset. That was the only accurate description. The boards had been raised and then replaced by someone who had taken care to return them to something close to their original position, but who had not managed to achieve the precision of the original installation. The grain alignment was off. The boards sat fractionally proud of their neighbors. To someone who did not look carefully, the floor was a floor. To someone who had looked at it before and knew what it was supposed to look like, something had changed. Utterback did not investigate further that day. He replaced the window latch, nailed the loose boards down with additional nails of a heavier gauge than the originals, and unleft. He went back twice more over the following weeks to check that the boards had not been disturbed again. They had not. He told his brother-in-law about the episode and said, in a tone that the brother-in-law remembered as carefully controlled, that he believed someone had been using the house, using it for something, and that he did not intend to find out what. He sold the property in October of 1887 to a man named Clement Varnell for $212. The county assessor noted the sale price in the margin of the transfer record with a single word: curious. Clement Varnell was 41 years old when he brought his family to Cutter's Ridge Road. He had spent 12 years as a foreman in a glass manufacturing works outside Pittsburgh, a position that had suited his temperament. The work required systematic attention to process, the ability to manage a crew of men without either friction or subservience, and a tolerance for the constant low-level danger of molten material and extreme heat. He was good at the work, and the work had treated him fairly until the contraction in orders that followed a shift in the regional economy, and the management decision to reduce the workforce by a quarter, which removed Clement Varnell from a job he had expected to hold until he chose to leave it. The severance was modest. The family's savings were adequate for a period of transition. His wife's cousin had mentioned, in passing, a property in western Pennsylvania that could be had cheaply. The cousin had heard of it secondhand and did not know its history in any detail. Anna Clement had gone to look at it alone in September of 1887 and had walked every room and pressed his thumb into every visible joint and looked at the foundation from every angle the exterior permitted. He found it sound. He found it better than sound. He found it the work of a builder who had approached the craft with the same systematic seriousness that Clement had always applied to his own work. And he recognized in the structure the evidence of a mind that he understood intuitively. He did not ask about the price. He did not negotiate. He paid the asking price and moved his family in within 6 weeks. It was the most significant practical decision of his life, and he made it in the way that competent men of his era frequently made significant decisions, on the basis of what he could see and verify, or without sufficient attention to the question of what he could not see. Margit Varnell was 37, a woman whose parents had come from the Dalarna region of Sweden in the early 1850s, settling first in New York and then following the Swedish migration corridor southwest into Pennsylvania's industrial belt. She had grown up bilingual, and Swedish remained the language of her emotional interior, even after decades of American life had made English the language of her daily world. She was quiet in the specific way of someone who had learned that observation was more useful than speech. She watched situations develop and formed her assessments privately before committing them to language, which meant that when she spoke, it was usually to say something that she had already thought through with care. She was, by the standards of her community, an unusually self-possessed woman, neither dependent on her husband's certainty nor threatened by it, capable of forming and holding her own conclusions without requiring his validation. Their oldest child, Uold, was 17, a broad-shouldered, deliberate young man who had inherited his father's practical intelligence without his father's tendency toward decisive commitment. Uold thought carefully before he acted, which made him cautious in situations that called for speed, but thorough in situations that rewarded patience. He was the child who most closely resembled Clement in the physical sense, and least resembled him in temperament. Their second child, Lena, each was 14. Bookish in the way that rural girls of the era could occasionally manage when a school was close enough to reach in decent weather and a parent valued education enough to make the effort. She had her mother's observational quality, but a greater willingness to speak what she observed. The two youngest children were boys, Oscar and Per, 9 and 7, named for grandfathers on the Swedish side of the family, in a way that Margit's parents had understood as the proper acknowledgement of roots in a country they would never return to. The family arrived in November and spent the first weeks in the practical absorption of a household establishing itself in a new place. Clement and Uold worked on the outbuildings, which needed more attention than the house itself. The barn roof had a section where the boards had warped away from the rafters, and 3 of the fence lines required new posts where the originals had rotted at the ground line. The house itself needed cleaning more than repair. Margit and Lena worked through it room by room with the systematic thoroughness that a woman of Margit's upbringing brought to such tasks, removing the accumulated residue of 11 years of vacancy. The dead insects, the mouse droppings, the cobwebs thick enough in the corners to resemble construction rather than neglect. The particular quality of surface grime that settles onto horizontal objects in an unoccupied space and eventually bonds to them chemically. The cleaning took several days. Each room emerged from the process clean in the visible sense, smelling of the lye soap and beeswax that Margit used, giving no outward indication of what it had been before her attention. Except the parlor. The parlor was clean after Margit's work, but it did not smell clean. It smelled of something beneath the cleaning, something that the soap and the beeswax occupied the surface of, without affecting the deeper layer. Margaret noticed this and attributed it to old wood and the accumulated vapor of a sealed space. She hung curtains on the eastern wall, moved the heaviest furniture to cover the area where the floorboards looked fractionally uneven, and told Clement about the boards. He said he would see to them in the spring. She accepted this and moved to the next task. The winters settled around the farmhouse with the particular authority of Pennsylvania winters in that valley country. Not the dramatic accumulations of the mountain regions, but a persistent, gray, moisture-laden cold that got into structures and bodies alike with a patient thoroughness that was harder to defend against than any single dramatic storm. The house held heat adequately in most of its rooms, but unevenly. The north-facing bedrooms where the boys slept required the wood stove to work continuously to maintain livable temperature. And even then, the outer corners of those rooms held a cold that seemed to resist the warmth without quite defeating it. The family adapted, as farm families of that era adapted to everything, by wearing more layers inside, by arranging themselves closer to heat sources in the evenings, by accepting the conditions as the ordinary negotiation of life in a farmhouse in winter. The first indication that something was wrong came in January. Oscar began waking in the middle of the night and coming to his parents' room, which he had not done since he was a small child. He complained of headaches, not the sharp, localized headaches of a head cold, but a pressure pain that he located behind his eyes and described, in the limited vocabulary of a 9-year-old, as feeling like his head was being pushed on from inside. The pain was worse in the mornings than at night, worse when he was indoors than when he was outside, worse, though this was a connection that none of the family made at the time, in the parlor than in any other room in the house. Margaret measured his temperature and found it slightly elevated. Well, not enough to indicate a serious fever, but enough to suggest the beginning of an illness. She moved his sleeping position away from the outer wall, where the cold was most present, and watched him carefully. The headaches continued. The temperature fluctuated, present on some days, absent on others, in a pattern that did not match the typical progression of any illness she recognized. Per began showing similar symptoms in February. The timing, one child declining, then a second showing the same early signs, suggested to Margaret an infectious cause, something that had passed from Oscar to his younger brother through the proximity of shared sleep. This was the rational interpretation, and she held it, while also noting, in the careful private inventory she maintained of things that did not quite add up, but that the pattern of Per's symptoms was not identical to Oscar's in its timing or its character. Per was not feverish in the way Oscar had been. Per was confused, not in the sudden, dramatic way of a child in the grip of a high fever, but in the gradual, incremental way of someone whose perceptions were being altered by something slow and cumulative. He lost track of conversations. He repeated questions he had asked minutes before. He sat at the supper table some evenings with an expression that Margaret described to herself, and later to Clement, as looking like a child who was listening to something no one else could hear. Clement noticed the same quality in both boys at the supper table one evening in late February, and the feeling that passed through him in the moment of noticing was one he had not felt since a specific day in the glassworks, when he had looked at a section of the furnace wall and understood, before he could have articulated why, that the refractory material was compromised in a way that was not yet visible on the surface, but that would become catastrophically visible if not addressed. It was the feeling of a competent man recognizing, in a system he was responsible for, the early signature of a failure he did not yet understand. He looked at his sons across the supper table. He said their names. It took 2 repetitions before either of them responded. He did not sleep well that night. He lay in the dark and thought about the parlor, about the smell that persisted beneath the cleaning, about the boards that someone had lifted and reset before him, about the room beneath the floor that he had not told Margaret about in any detail, about the iron rings in the stone of the eastern wall that he had been pretending for 3 months were something he could think about later. He had told himself he would understand them in context once he had done more research, once the spring came and he could investigate properly. He had told himself this because the alternative, understanding them in the only context that their configuration naturally suggested, was an understanding that would require him to act. And he had not been ready to act. And he had not been ready to be the person who had moved his family into a house that had iron rings in a sealed room beneath the parlor floor. The smell from the eastern wall intensified in March with the partial thaw. It was stronger than it had been in the fall, stronger than Margaret's initial description of old wood and sealed air had allowed for. And it carried in its register something that she could not resolve into any category of organic decay she had encountered before. It was not the smell of a dead animal in the walls, which she had experienced before and which had a directional quality, a point of origin you could locate and address. This smell was distributed. It came from the floor itself, from the gap between the boards and whatever was beneath them. And it carried something in its lower register that she found herself reluctant to investigate because she had learned, across a winter of careful observation, that the things in this house that did not have ordinary explanations were connected to each other in a way she had not yet fully mapped. She told Clement the smell required addressing. Clement agreed. On the morning of March 19th, 1888, he and Ewald moved the furniture away from the eastern wall and began to examine the floor. What they found in the first 15 minutes was enough to stop both of them in silence. The boards nearest the wall had been opened before. Not once, but multiple times. The evidence visible in the nail patterns, if you knew to look for them. The original nailing was consistent, regular intervals, the same gauge throughout, the work of a careful hand. Over those original nail holes, 2 subsequent sets of nails had been driven, each at slightly different intervals, each of slightly different gauge, each penetrating the boards in positions that almost but not quite matched the original. Someone had opened the floor at least twice after the original installation. Someone had replaced the boards each time, pressing them back into position with enough care to make the disturbance non-obvious, but not enough care to restore the original precision. The grain alignment was off by fractions. The boards sat slightly proud of their neighbors. To Clement's eye, the eye of a man who had spent his working life assessing the precision of other men's work, the discrepancies were unmistakable. He pried up the first board. The smell that came up from below was a concentrated version of what had been diffusing through the floor for months. The same character, but without the dilution of the boards, and without the filtering effect of the wood in the gaps. It was enough to make Ewald step back and press his sleeve to his face. Clement did not step back. He pried up the second board and the third. He called for Ewald to bring a lantern. The lantern, held down through the opening on its chain, cast its light into a space that was not a crawl space, not a cellar, not anything that the standard vocabulary of residential construction had a comfortable term for. It was a room of deliberate, considered dimensions, approximately 8 feet in one direction and what appeared to be 10 or more in the other, the full extent not visible from the opening. The floor was packed earth. The walls were the fitted stone of the exterior foundation, only the same dry-laid construction visible in the exterior foundation walls of the house. The same hand, clearly. The same care. The ceiling was the underside of the parlor floor, reinforced from below with additional joists that ran in the opposite direction to the main floor framing, creating a layered structure that was significantly more massive than the floor above it, required for any load-bearing purpose. The additional reinforcement served a different function. It made the floor above denser, heavier, less responsive to sound transmitted through the framing. It made the parlor above quieter from below. Whatever happened in the room below would not be audible to any normal degree in the room above. Along the eastern wall, which was the exterior foundation wall, iron rings were set into the stone at intervals of approximately 4 feet. 3 rings, set into the stone at a height that Clement measured, without wanting to be precise about what the measurement meant, at approximately 3.5 feet from the ground. A height consistent with a specific posture. A height consistent with a specific use. He held the lantern steady for a long time and looked at the rings. They were not decorative. They were not functional in any of the ordinary ways that iron rings might be incorporated into a storage space. They were heavy, well-mounted, set with the same care as everything else in the structure, set to hold something that pushed against them with sustained force. There was no ambiguity in their purpose, if you allowed yourself to see it. Clement replaced the boards. He told Ewald they would discuss it inside. He did not discuss it with Margit or Lena. He went to the barn alone and sat in the cold for a long time. When he came inside for supper, he told his family that the smell was coming from an old drainage issue that had been improperly sealed by a previous owner, and that he would have it addressed in the spring when the ground permitted the necessary work. Margit looked at him across the supper table in the particular way she had. The way that meant she had heard the incomplete version and was deciding whether to wait for the complete one. She said nothing. She understood that there were things a man needed to carry for a time before he could put them into words that would not break something. She waited. She would say, years later, and that the supper table that evening was the last moment she experienced the house as something that might still resolve into ordinariness. After that, she was waiting for the shape of what she already, at some level, understood. What Clement could not have known from the deed records and the county transfer documents available to him was the specific operational history of what the room beneath his parlor had been built to do. That knowledge existed, distributed across the memories of several people still living in the region in 1888, and in the private papers of at least one person who had died 14 years before. But it had never been incorporated into any official record, because the man who built the room had been extraordinarily careful about what he wrote down and what he allowed others to understand about the purposes of his construction. Absalom Prewitt, who had built the house on Cutter's Ridge Road in 1841 and 1842, was not merely a carpenter. He was not merely a careful man and a skilled craftsman and a church-going member of his community. He was, for a period of approximately 12 years, the operator of a specific kind of facility, a holding and transit space for human beings who had been captured in the act of seeking freedom and who were being held invisibly. While the paperwork that would return them to bondage was completed and the arrangements for their transportation south were made, the language of the era had several terms for what Prewitt did. The formal legal term was recovery agent, and it was a term with legal standing. The Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850 created a framework within which men like Prewitt operated under color of law, performing what they and their legal advocates consistently framed as the legitimate enforcement of property rights established by the Constitution of the United States. The network that Prewitt operated within had tentacles that ran through several Pennsylvania counties and connected, through intermediaries, to agents in Maryland and Virginia who did the initial capture work. Prewitt's role was intermediate and logistical. He provided a location in which captured individuals could be held without public visibility. In a county that was not the county of initial capture, while the legal documents necessary for transport south were assembled, verified, and signed by the relevant magistrates. Pennsylvania was a free state, but the federal law superseded state law on this specific question, and there were magistrates in western Pennsylvania in the 1840s and 1850s who were willing to sign the relevant documents if presented to them correctly. The room had been built for this purpose. Every element of its construction reflected the requirements of that purpose. The acoustic reinforcement of the ceiling, so that sounds from below would not penetrate to the living space above. The absence of any ventilation that could be identified from the exterior. The iron rings set at the height appropriate for securing individuals in a specific posture. The dimensions, large enough to hold several people for several days, but small enough to be invisible in any architectural examination of the structure. The packed earth floor, which absorbed moisture and biological residue without the staining and odor retention that wood or stone would have shown. The sealed entrance, disguised as ordinary flooring, in a room that served the ordinary social function of a parlor. A room where visitors would sit, where the surface of respectability was maintained, above a space in which the machinery of that respectability's opposite was concealed. People had been held in that room. The records that Clement would find months later in the packed earth of the southeast corner documented specific transactions, names or partial names, dates, amounts, outcomes. The records covered a period from 1843 to approximately 1856, and they documented at minimum 17 separate transactions, as Prewitt had logged them. The outcomes column in Prewitt's ledger used 3 categories: returned as arranged, delivered to connection in Hagerstown, and matter closed. The third category appeared 4 times. What matter closed meant in Prewitt's accounting was not defined in the ledger. It was not defined anywhere in the available record. It was the kind of phrase that performs the function of a definition while actively refusing to provide one. A sealed door in language, serving the same purpose as the sealed boards in the parlor floor. The illness that had been progressing through the Varnell household since January was not a supernatural phenomenon. It was not a haunting in any sense that required a vocabulary beyond the material. It was chemistry. The sealed room, in its 4 decades of closure, had become a slow-release repository of compounds that the sciences of the 1880s did not yet have a complete framework for understanding. Organic material, biological trace, the atmospheric residue of a confined space that had held frightened human bodies in extended captivity, under conditions of extreme physiological stress. What fear does to a human body over days and weeks is not merely psychological. It is chemical. It is hormonal. It is present in the breath and the sweat and every biological output of a body in sustained crisis. Multiplied across 17 documented transactions, across the specific biology of the packed earth floor and the sealed stone walls accumulated over 40 years of closure. The room had become a kind of chemical record of its own history, not metaphysically, not spiritually, physically, in the air. In the particulate matter that the slight seasonal movement of the boards had been releasing, gradually and invisibly, into the living space above. The headaches that Oscar and Per were experiencing were neurological in origin, consistent with low-level exposure to compounds that in sufficient concentration would have produced more acute effects. The confusion, the emotional volatility, the quality of unfocused attention that their father had noticed at the supper table. These were symptoms. They were the body's response to something that was in the air of that house, and that the medicine of the era had no instrument to detect and no vocabulary to name precisely. Dr. Hartwell Brosius, when he came to see Oscar in early April, could identify the symptom cluster, but not its cause. He used the word miasma, the old pre-germ theory term for bad air, because it was the closest available language. He said the children needed outdoor air. He said whatever was causing the smell in the eastern parlor needed to be addressed. He did not go below the boards. Clement did not show him the room. The conversation stayed at the level of ventilation and drainage, and the family's need to keep the children outdoors as much as the spring weather allowed. Oscar Varnell died on April the 29th, 1888. He was 9 years old. The cause of death recorded by Brosius was brain fever, a category that covered a range of neurological deteriorations that the medicine of the era could not more specifically differentiate. He had been ill for 3 months with a progression that had accelerated sharply in his final 3 weeks, moving from headaches and confusion to convulsions and extended periods of unconsciousness that the family watched over without the resources to do anything except be present. He was buried in the Harrowfield Lutheran Cemetery on the 1st of May. Ewald dug the grave because Clement could not bring himself to do it, and Margaret would not let Clement tell Ewald why his father could not dig his brother's grave. Per became critically ill within 2 weeks of Oscar's death. The progression in Per was faster than it had been in Oscar, as though the mechanism causing the illness had optimized itself through the first child, or as though Per's lower body weight made him more susceptible. Margaret, who had by now constructed in her mind a connection she could not yet fully articulate, but could no longer ignore, between the boards, between the smell, between the children's decline, between the eastern parlor that had never smelled clean no matter how many times she cleaned it, made a decision without consulting Clement. She packed Per's things on a Wednesday evening and took him the following morning to her sister's house in Kellerton, 12 miles away. Clement did not argue. He was beyond arguing. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched his wife load Per into the wagon, and he did not ask when she would be back, because he understood that his wife was doing the only clearly correct thing that had been done in that house since November. Per recovered, slowly. The headaches recurred for months after he left the house, and then, and gradually, over a period of approximately a year, diminished and then largely ceased. He would carry a residual sensitivity for the rest of his life, a susceptibility to headache under conditions of confined space or poor ventilation that his physicians, when he was old enough to consult physicians on his own behalf, could not connect to any identified underlying condition. The connection was there, but it existed in the gap between what had happened to his body in that house and what the medicine of his era had the tools to see. Clement remained in the house. Lena remained with her father because Clement would not send her away without an explanation, and the explanation was not yet fully formed. Through April and into May, Lena began showing what Brosius described as nervous exhaustion, a fatigue that was not the fatigue of illness in the conventional sense, but a depletion that was more fundamental, as though the ordinarily available energy of a young body was simply not responding to its usual sources of replenishment. She slept and woke unrefreshed. She sat down to tasks and forgot what she had intended to do. She developed a sensitivity to sound that made the ordinary acoustic environment of a working farm, the animals, the tools, the noise of weather on the roof, physically painful in a way she could not explain, and that bore no relationship to any previous sensitivity she had shown. Clement watched his daughter's deterioration across 3 weeks in May, and understood, like with the specific torment of a man who has recognized a danger he failed to prevent, that the spring had come too late. He had meant to investigate the room properly. He had meant to find the explanation that would let him decide what to do. The spring had come, and his son was in the ground, and his daughter was sick in a house above a room with iron rings in the wall. And he had waited too long. He went back into the room in the second week of June. He went alone in the middle of the afternoon, with 2 lanterns and a carpenter's rule and a short-handled spade. He spent 2 hours below the boards. He measured every surface. He examined the iron rings with the full attention he had been withholding from them since March. He moved along the perimeter of the room with 1 lantern held close to the wall, not looking for anything that the first examination had missed. In the southeast corner, where the stone of the 2 walls met at 90 degrees, he noticed a variation in the surface of the earth floor. A slight depression, perhaps 4 inches lower than the surrounding grade, approximately 2 feet square, with an edge that was too precise to be natural settling. He took the spade and broke the surface carefully. At 8 inches, the spade struck something that was not stone and not root. He reached into the excavation with his hand and pulled up a cloth-wrapped bundle that had been packed into the cavity with care. The cloth folded over the contents and pressed flat to minimize its profile. The cloth had deteriorated significantly in 4 decades of burial. It came apart in sections as he lifted it, releasing a smell of mold and compressed age. The contents were intact. A collection of folded papers, approximately 40 sheets of varying size, bound together with cord that had decayed to the point of fragility. The papers had been wrapped in the cloth and then wrapped again in something. A section of oilcloth or treated leather, he could not determine which, that had protected them from the moisture of the packed earth with sufficient effectiveness to preserve their legibility despite the decades. He took them to the surface, into the light, and he read them. They were records, not letters, not a personal account, not any form of document that carried the heat of individual emotion. Records, us in the manner of a man who had learned to document his professional activities for purposes of legal protection and financial accountability, using the flat transactional language of commerce applied to human beings. Names, where names were available. Physical descriptions, where names were not. Dates. Amounts paid by unnamed parties for services rendered. References to other agents and locations. The Chester County connection. The Lancaster agent. Delivered to the party in Hagerstown as arranged. Consigned to the gentleman from Baltimore. References to outcomes in the 3 categories Prewitt used. Returned as arranged, delivered to Hagerstown, matter closed. 4 entries in the 3rd category. No elaboration. The ledger covered the years 1843 through 1856, the handwriting consistent throughout. The same small, neat, business-like hand, the same lack of affect, the same quality of a man who had organized himself around the proposition that what he was doing was legitimate commerce, and that the documentation of commerce was a form of legal protection. Clement Varnell sat on the packed earth floor of that room for a long time, holding those papers. He was not a man of scholarly background. He had left school at 12, but he could read, and he could understand what he was reading. And he understood it completely by the time he climbed back through the gap in the parlor floor and replaced the boards and sent Lena to Kellerton that evening. He went to the constable, Rudolf Fenstermacher, the following morning. He laid the papers on Fenstermacher's desk and told him where they had been found and how, and described the room and the rings. He answered Fenstermacher's 3 questions completely. He agreed to Fenstermacher's request that he say nothing to anyone pending consultation with county authorities. He shook the constable's hand and walked back to his farmhouse and sat in the barn for the rest of the afternoon. What Fenstermacher understood when he read the ledger was what Clement had understood, plus the additional layer of local knowledge that Fenstermacher's 9 years as constable had given him. A layer that included certain names, certain families, certain institutional connections, that the ledger's references pointed toward obliquely, but without enough precision to establish legal liability in the absence of corroborating documentation. The ledger was not sufficient by itself. It was deeply suggestive. It named a network, and it did not name the network's living members with the specificity that a prosecution would have required. What it did do, what made it significant beyond its historical value and dangerous beyond its evidential value, was connect a set of Pennsylvania locations, and by implication, a set of Pennsylvania families, to a federal criminal enterprise that had operated under color of law, but that had, since the passage of the 13th Amendment and the end of the war, become definitively criminal in its historical character. The men the ledger gestured toward were not men who had simply held political positions that the law had since condemned. They were men, or their fathers and uncles were men, who had participated in specific transactions involving specific human beings, documented in Prewitt's businesslike hand, and that could potentially be traced through other county records, other correspondence, other witnesses who might still be living. The consultation took 6 weeks. County officials came to see Fenstermacher. Fenstermacher reported to Clement that the matter was being reviewed. The concrete was poured into the room beneath the parlor by workmen from Kellerton in late August, sealing the floor permanently. The county coroner's report on Oscar Varnell's cause of death, which Brocius had submitted with a handwritten note attached, expressing his unease that the specific pattern of the boy's decline was connected to conditions in the house and warranted investigation, was refiled under an administrative category that was not specifically designed to bury it, but that had the practical effect of making it difficult to find. The ledger itself disappeared into a county administrative file that was classified under a reference number with no corresponding description in the main index. Clement received the papers back from Fenstermacher in October, with a cover letter from a county administrator whose name Clement could not later recall clearly, explaining that the county had reviewed the documents, found them to be historical in nature, and determined that no current legal proceeding was warranted. The letter used the phrase "matter closed," a phrase that, given the ledger's own use of the same phrase, may or may not have been chosen deliberately. Clement did not ask. He sold the property in October of 1888 for $180, $32 less than he had paid the year before, and moved his family to Allegheny County. He never returned to Harrowfield. He never spoke publicly about the house or what had been found in it. Margaret outlived him by 11 years. In the last year of her life, when she was 69, and confined mostly to the house by the arthritis that had been advancing in her joints for a decade,
I saw him.
She dictated a series of letters to Lena, not for circulation, she said, just for keeping. The letters covered the house on Cutter's Ridge Road in a detail and directness that she had never managed in 40 years of living with the experience. She described the parlor on the first day she cleaned it. She described the quality of the air. She described the night she lay awake in the late winter and understood, with a clarity that had come to her all at once rather than by accumulation, that what she was smelling from beneath the eastern wall was not wood and not drainage. She described the supper table on the night Clement came back from the barn and told them about the drainage problem, and she had understood that her husband was protecting her from something by not telling her, and that the thing he was protecting her from was something he had not yet found the shape of himself. She described the evening she loaded Pear into the wagon. She described Clement's face in the doorway. She wrote, "The worst part was not what had been done in that room. The worst part was understanding that the house had been passed from one family to the next for 40 years, each time a little cheaper than before. And that's somewhere. In the county, in the township, and in the business of men talking to men in places where women were not present. There had always been people who knew, or suspected enough to know, that the price reflected something, that the cheapness of the house was not ignorance, that the ignorance was chosen, that what my children breathed was the air of a room that could have been opened decades before we came to it, and that the reason it was not opened was that the opening would have required a conversation that no one was prepared to have. She wrote, "The horror of it was not that something inhuman had been done. The horror was that it had been done carefully, by a man who went to church and kept records, and that the records were kept not from shame, but from the need to prove that the accounts were settled." She set down the pen after that sentence and did not speak again for some time. And Lena, who was transcribing, waited. Cornelia Pfaltz was 63 years old in 1927 when a county clerk named Wallace Hederman found the file and wrote to her. She had been documenting the history of freedom and its suppression in western Pennsylvania for 15 years. And she had learned in those 15 years to read the administrative record with the specific attention of someone who understood that the most important information in an archive is often the information that has been misclassified. A misclassified file is not necessarily an accident. A file that has been moved from one reference system to another without cross-indexing is not necessarily incompetence. The archive reflects the intentions of the people who organized it, and the people who organized it had intentions that were not always recorded. She had developed, across 15 years, a finely calibrated sense for the difference between a file that had been lost and a file that had been misplaced in a particular direction. She spent 2 days with Prewitt's ledger and the surrounding documentation. She took careful notes. She identified, from the combination of partial names, location references, dates, and the cross-referencing of those elements against other records she had spent years accumulating, on 4 individuals or institutions that could be connected to the transactions in Prewitt's ledger with what she considered reasonable evidentiary confidence. 2 were deceased. 1 was alive, an elderly man of considerable local standing in a town 30 miles from Harrowfield, a retired businessman whose family name appeared in the ledger in a form consistent with a connection to the Lancaster network, referenced in one of Prewitt's entries. The 4th reference was to a specific building, a property still in existence and operating in a different capacity in 1927, that could be connected to at least 2 of the documented transactions. She wrote a report. She submitted it to a regional historical journal that published work on the pre-war period. The journal accepted it provisionally, then deferred publication on a pending additional review, then declined it without specific explanation. She submitted it to 2 other academic journals. Both declined. She submitted it to a Pittsburgh newspaper, where an editor expressed genuine interest, then became unreachable. She spent 4 years attempting to place the report in a venue with public reach. And across those 4 years, she watched the specific set of obstacles she encountered and thought carefully about what the pattern of those obstacles told her about who in the region was still invested in the particular silence that the Prewitt ledger had the potential to break. In 1931, she died. Her papers went to her niece, and eventually, in 1935, to a regional historical society that cataloged them correctly and completely, and placed them in a reading room where any researcher with legitimate purpose could access them, which several did across the following decades. Without those researchers' subsequent work achieving sufficient momentum to move the report from the archive into the public record in any durable way. The house on Cutter's Ridge Road burned in 1901 when a barn fire spread in dry conditions and reached the main structure before it could be controlled. The walls that remained standing were pulled down by the new owner. The concrete slab that had been poured in the summer of 1888 was not disturbed. It sat beneath the rubble of the demolished walls and then beneath the accumulated earth of subsequent seasons, invisible, unmarked in any survey, belonging to no description in any county record. The iron rings were beneath the concrete. The packed earth that had held Prewitt's ledger was beneath the concrete. The specific geography of what had happened in that room over 12 years was preserved, in physical terms, beneath approximately 3 feet of accumulated material, on a piece of land that had been bought and sold and reclassified and renamed until the connection between the surface and what lay beneath it was, to anyone consulting the available records, functionally invisible. Per Varnell was interviewed in 1939 by Cornelia Faltz's niece, who was attempting to continue her aunt's work. He was 58 years old. He said he did not remember the house with clarity. He had been too young, and the memories he had were the compressed, emotionally saturated memories of early childhood, which do not resolve into the kind of sequential, detailed account that makes for useful historical testimony. But he remembered the smell. He said it was not a smell that belonged to any ordinary category of domestic odor, not wood, not earth, not decay in the conventional sense. He said it was something he had encountered once more in his adult life, in a specific place in France in 1918, in circumstances that he did not describe in detail. He said the two smells were, to his memory, identical. He said, "It is the smell of people who were afraid for a long time in a small place. I did not know that when I was 7. I know it now." He did not say anything further about it. He thanked Cornelia Faltz's niece for her time, went back to his house, and did not respond to her subsequent letters. What do you think really happened to matter closed in Absalom Prewitt's ledger? What does it mean that these records survived every attempt to bury them? In the earth, in the filing system, in the indifference of institutions that preferred their histories clean? And what does it mean that the house was sold repeatedly, at prices that reflected something, to families who were not told what that something was? Leave your answer below. If this story gave you something to think about, or something to lose sleep over, share it with someone who needs to understand that the most disturbing histories are not the ones that cannot be explained, but the ones that can. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit the notification bell.
They say just forget. Move on like it's easy. But forgetting you feels like remembering someone I've never seen. I've been trying to erase you from the places in my mind, but the harder that I fight it, the more you're hard to leave behind. Every memory keeps slipping through the cracks I try to close, like a face I should remember, but somehow never know. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Every moment turns to fragments, every thought just fades to blue, like I'm searching for a feeling that still only leads to you. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. I'm freezing, I'm bleeding, slowly fading away. But don't worry, I'm fine. The cold has settled in my heartbeat, like winter living in my veins. Every breath feels numb and fragile, every smile just hides the pain. I'm breaking quietly in silence, falling slow without a sound. Yet I keep saying I'm okay, while my world burns to the ground. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. Maybe pain just learned to live here, maybe sorrow feels like home. So I wear my wounds like armor and survive them all alone. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. If you ever see me smiling, know it's just my last defense, 'cause sometimes love means hiding how much you're suffering. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. It's okay.